Alright, so in our last video, we saw the English Civil Wars, which resulted in Charles I getting his head chopped off, Oliver Cromwell becoming a military dictator of England, and Charles's son Charles taking the title Charles II, but getting trounced by Cromwell and having to flee to France for the time being. So what we're going to do now is talk about what happened after all of this. And so this initial period is known as the English Commonwealth. So the English Commonwealth is a period from 1649 to 1658, although that second date is debatable. But it definitely starts with the execution of Charles. England does no longer have a king. There's no more king of England. So what are they? So Cromwell, who is kind of de facto in charge, I guess we'll say he's the closest thing to a leader in England, chooses not to become king. Instead, he takes the title Lord Protector. And all of this is agreed to by about 100 members of Parliament. These are the guys that have remained sitting in Parliament since 1640. So normally there are about 600 members of Parliament. All that's left now is about 100. And these are the guys that haven't gotten sick of everything that has happened, mostly the execution of the king. Most members of Parliament simply didn't want anything to do with that. The army got rid of any members of Parliament that might have argued with them or debated what they were doing to the king, and so they were kicked out. And so all that's left are about 100 members of Parliament who actively like what Cromwell is doing and want to see him continue doing what he's doing. So these guys that are still here are really loyal to Cromwell and the new model army. In 1653, Cromwell dismisses Parliament and rules alone, pretty much as a military dictator. And that's pretty much how England was run until 1658, when Cromwell dies. And this was a new thing, so no one really knew what to do next. So Cromwell dies. His son takes the title. But just long story short, his son is not nearly as talented as his father. And everybody now kind of looks around and they say, well, what do we do now? So the army, the new model army, puts Parliament back in charge. And they kind of fall back to the background. So the new model army puts Parliament back in charge, and they don't disband, but they kind of take themselves out of the political picture right now. Without Cromwell, this situation was not going to work nearly as well, and the army itself wasn't liked well enough by the people to actively be in charge unless they started like killing people, which they didn't really want to do. So the only real solution the army had was to get Parliament back and let them figure out what to do. So now, this period of time is called the Restoration. So the Restoration happens in 1660. Two important things happen during the Restoration. Parliament comes back in full strength. So all the members that had been kicked out or forced to leave, they all come back. But the more important thing they do is they call Charles II and ask him to be king. And he accepts. Everyone is happy. Because things can kind of go back to normal. So pretty much everything goes back to the way it was. Before the Civil Wars. So all the religions go back to where they were. We have Charles as King of England and Scotland and Ireland. So pretty much we just go back to where we started before all of this, except now it's Charles II instead of Charles I. Everything goes back to kind of the way it was. There were a few attempts to reform, like the Puritans, those really hardcore Calvinists. The Puritans lose a lot of power, and a lot of them go to the Netherlands, and a lot of them come to North America, where we know them better as like the Pilgrims, but that's for a different class. So the Puritans kind of lose a lot of the power and authority they had in England, and a lot of them go to the Netherlands. Some go to North America. But now the issue is what happens to these countries religiously, because all of those same issues with having three different religious traditions, so the Irish being Catholic, the Scottish being Calvinist, and the English being Anglican, there's still some unresolved stuff there. So the religious question is back. So the religious question is the thing that we have to deal with now. Charles II was maybe Catholic. It's hard to tell. He was probably deep down one of those Arminians. But he kept his own personal religious views secret and, talked a good game. He said everything he was supposed to say to the people he was supposed to say it to. But it was unclear. But everyone was tired of fighting. And Charles turned out to be a pretty good guy. Like, he was just a fun, merry person. In fact, he was nicknamed the Merry Monarch. So the religious stuff, it was a question for Charles, but, the happiness that everyone felt with the war being over and just Charles's general nice guy attitude, we can live with this guy. The problem comes when Charles dies. So Charles didn't have any children, any legitimate children. I think he had about a dozen illegitimate children. He was the Merry Monarch and all, but he had no legitimate children. And so his brother, James, becomes king. And so now he's James II. Now, the problem with James was that James was actually Catholic. Like, he was an actual Catholic person. He was out and open about being Catholic. Because he was the second son of the king, so Charles was the older brother, James was the younger brother, it wasn't that important that James be Anglican, because it was very likely that Charles would have lots of children and then the line would continue through him. So James was actually Catholic, and that was a problem. But it wasn't that big of a problem. He was actually Catholic, but he was pretty old. He was pretty old, and he had 2 adult daughters who were raised Anglican. So when Charles II died, the situation was this. We're going to have a Catholic king for a little while, but he's old, and when he dies, we'll have an Anglican queen again, which we've done before and wasn't actually that bad. So we just got to live out the rest of James's life. When he dies, we'll have an Anglican queen again. The last one wasn't so bad. But a monkey wrench gets thrown into the machine. James, who remember is really old, has a child with his wife, a son, and that throws every plan they had out the window, because now this son is going to become king after James dies, and it's likely that this son will be raised Catholic. And so James, who is really old, is going to have a Catholic son who is going to live for a really, really long time, most likely, and have a lot of children, which would create a Catholic line of kings, which is going to undo all of this stuff that Henry and Elizabeth did so much to start in England. So this has the possibility to derail the entire Anglican Church. So, here's what happens next. This thing in history is known as the Glorious Revolution. And it happens in 1688. So, to fix this problem, members of Parliament go to the Netherlands to meet with James's oldest daughter, her name is Mary, who married the leader of the Netherlands. His name is William. So, members of Parliament go to the Netherlands secretly to meet with James's oldest daughter, Mary, who would have become queen had James not had his son. And they basically ask William and Mary to take over as King and Queen of England. So they go over to the Netherlands and they ask William and Mary if they would like to take the throne. There are some conditions. The conditions are that they have to become Anglican. They both have to become Anglican. Mary was, William wasn't. So William agrees to become an Anglican. And they have to agree to work with Parliament. Both conditions they agree to. So both of those conditions are agreed to, and then William and Mary and some Dutch soldiers sail to England. James is tipped off that they're coming. And instead of putting up a fight, James and his family go to France, where they live the rest of their life protected by Louis XIV, the Catholic King of France, who we are going to get to know pretty well in the next series of videos. So James and his family go off to live in France safely and secure. Nobody has any problem with James. It's not James's fault that any of this stuff happened. And I think that's why this is called the Glorious Revolution, because there was almost no bloodshed. And so what this does is it really sets up the idea of constitutional monarchy. Which is the idea that monarchs have to follow the rules. And they are a part of the government, not the whole thing. That's what a constitutional monarchy is. Monarchs have to follow the rules, and they are part of the government. They are not the whole thing. They are partners. So once William and Mary get to England, Parliament declares the throne vacant, and William and Mary are asked to be king and queen. Now, this sets a precedent, because what this says is that it's the people who give the king and queen power, not the other way around. So Parliament asks them to be king and queen. So let's do a little bit of an epilogue. So what happens after all of this? So there are still people who want James and his son to be king. And most of these people are in Scotland. And they led a series of rebellions called the Jacobite rebellions, or the Jacobite Wars. These pretty much end in 1707 with the union of England and Scotland. And so at that point, it becomes known as the United Kingdom. So William and Mary ruled until 1692, when Mary died. And then William kept going until 1702, so for another 10 years. They didn't have any children because Mary died relatively young. She was in her early 30s when she died. William, there is some speculation that William may have actually been gay, so he didn't have any children either. So the throne then goes to James's younger daughter, Anne. And she dies again without any children. And we will pick that story up probably into time period 3, because that's when we start to see the actual emergence of political parties in England. But James's youngest daughter, when she dies, the throne then goes to her distant German cousins. So the King of England then goes to, or the throne of England then goes to Germans who are from one of the little Germanies called Hanover. I think we've mentioned that name before, but we'll get to know those guys, the Georges, in some subsequent videos. The last little bit of this, I kind of teased this a second ago, is the start of what we might call political factions that will eventually turn into political parties. And there are two kind of opposing views as to how much power the king should have and how much power the parliament should have. So one of these groups are called the Whigs. So these guys favored more parliamentary power and less power for the king. And the other faction, these guys are known as the Tories. The Tories are the opposite. They wanted less parliamentary power and a stronger monarch. And these two factions will eventually kind of become more organized. And when they become more organized with like actual rules for what they're doing, instead of just kind of being a group of like-minded members of parliament, that's when we get political parties. Once they kind of become formal organizations with rules and procedures, that's the start of political parties. But the ideas behind these two parties are going to start right around this time, because the Germans, when they become king, they don't speak English. And so they kind of leave all of this stuff up to Parliament to figure out on their own. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, and we'll cover all of that stuff in due course when we get there. So for right now, this is the end of the stuff on the English Civil Wars, the Restoration, and the Glorious Revolution. The next video we do will be a little bit of stuff on the Netherlands and Poland, because both of those places are also more or less constitutional monarchies. So that'll be the next video in the sequence. But until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.